This is my second interview with Stephen Braude, a legend when it comes to the convergence of parapsychology and philosophy. He's the 2022 winner of the Parapsychological Association's prestigious Outstanding Career Award, an award given to individuals whose efforts have advanced the discipline of parapsychology for over 2 decades. Stephen's essay, A Rational Guide to the Best Evidence for Post-Mortem Survival, was a runner-up in the celebrated Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies 2021 contest. In 2014, he was awarded the FWH Myers Memorial Medal from the Society for Psychical Research. Stephen has written numerous books, including The Gold Leaf Lady and Immortal Remains. Scroll into the description for timestamps, extra info, and useful links. And if you enjoy this video, please like, comment, and share. Thank you. Thank you for doing this with me again, Steve. I really appreciate it. In our first interview, we discussed consciousness and psychic phenomena, amongst other things. This time around, I've been looking forward to talking about the evidence for the survival of consciousness after death. So to kick us off, can you please talk a little bit about the body of evidence for survival and about your thoughts on it?
One of the things that I find very striking about the evidence for survival is that people tend either to greatly overestimate its quality or underestimate its quality.
Yeah.
A lot of people are looking for some sort of concrete proof of survival. Mm-hmm. Strictly speaking, we're not going to get a proof of survival. There's no such thing as real proof with regard to empirical data. We know what the word proof means in connection with mathematics and logic, mm-hmm. but empirical claims never enjoy that degree of certitude. And one of the first challenges we face when we look at the evidence suggesting survival is that no matter where you turn, you can't get away from making various unverified assumptions. I mean, there is no such thing as a purely empirical inquiry. I mean, all our observational data, what we take it to mean, how we understand it, how we describe the world, rests on various assumptions of one kind or another. Mm-hmm. I mean, even a simple statement like the table is brown, not the kind of observational statement that underlies virtually everything we do in life. We make various assumptions when we say the table is brown. For example, we assume that colors are properties that remain stable when they're unobserved. Mm-hmm. But that hasn't always been assumed to be the case. In antiquity, a number of people thought that when we observe an object, we change the object. We change its properties. And even in more recent philosophical times, the so-called new riddle of induction raises the possibility that observing an object will change its properties. So no matter where we go in assessing the evidence for survival, we're going to run up against some assumptions or other, usually mm-hmm. assumptions about the nature of observation, the nature of properties, the nature of causality, or methodological assumptions about what kind of investigative procedures are appropriate for the empirical domain in question. So the study of survival evidence is fraught with all sorts of uncertainties. And it comes out very clearly when we look at particular bodies of evidence. And I assume we're going to take a peek at that.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to jump around a few of them. Before we do, though, I was wondering if you could also say a few words about something that kind of is right next to all of this. It's very much in and around and it's implicated in this whole survival discussion, and that's the idea of the living agent psi hypothesis or super psi hypothesis versus kind of survival. So this is a frequent debate that people discuss, a philosophical debate if you want. There's interesting points in either way, but either way, could you just say kind of a few words on that? Maybe people aren't familiar with that. Maybe some people aren't familiar with that. What's it all about? What does it mean? Where do you stand on it as well, I guess, if you want to talk about that in brief. If not, we'll circle back to that later.
Okay. Well, if you're looking for alternatives to the survival hypothesis, there are several major categories of options. The first would be what I've called the usual suspects. You could try to explain away the evidence for survival by appealing to fraud, malobservation, and so on.
Yeah.
Now, the best cases clearly can't be accommodated that way. So the next level of skepticism would be to try to explain the survival evidence in terms of what we can call the unusual suspects. And there we would be appealing to things like latent abilities, dissociative creativity, unusual mnemonic abilities, things of that sort. And some of the cases are actually amenable to explanation in terms of the unusual suspects. But again, the best ones resist appeal to the unusual suspects. That leaves the big contender, and that's often and misleadingly called super psi, a term I can't stand. More recently, Michael Sedov has suggested we should call it living agent psi, or LAP. The problem with super psi, by the way, is it's not clear what the word super means. I mean, there are different Boggle thresholds.
Sure.
In the human population. And what
would unlimited psi, would that be kind of better, do you think?
Possibly, except we don't know whether it's unlimited. We just know
but that's the argument, right? Am I right or wrong with that? The idea is behind it is that it could be. We like that we don't know where the limit lies.
Well, actually, I take that position, but I think the people who appeal to super psi would be content, at least some people would be content with assuming or arguing that it's greater than what we see in ordinary laboratory studies of psi. It doesn't have to be unlimited. And also, I think some people regard the word super in super psi as being analogous to the way we use the term super with respect to superhero.
Right.
As opposed to super glue. I mean, superhero, as the word super suggests right from the start that we're talking about something incredible. But we know what we mean by super glue, it's really, really good glue. And super psi could just be really, really good psi. I like the idea of living agent psi. It doesn't involve any scale of amazingness. We have no legitimate scale of amazingness, so some objective scale of super amazingness. So we should just abandon super psi. I think it serves only to cloud reasoning on the subject. So what is the super psi hypothesis, or the living agent psi hypothesis? It's that evidence suggesting survival can be explained in terms of things that the living do. So, for example, if a medium says, your Uncle Harry is here, and he wants to say he's glad you're giving up your accounting job and you've decided to become a lion tamer. Now, the question is, how does let me start that again. I've got a better example.
Sure.
Here's the way the living agent psi hypothesis would work. Suppose a medium transmits a message from a deceased person, and the deceased person says, there's a second will that nobody knows about that's hidden in a secret compartment in my desk. And suppose subsequent investigation finds the desk, finds the secret compartment, and finds the will, so that it's confirmed. Now, the thing is, if the information allegedly transmitted by the deceased can be verified, then it was available all along for living persons' clairvoyance.
Yeah.
And so right away, it looks like we have a standoff between the living agent psi alternative and the survival alternative. And that's the general sort of strategy that the living agent psi hypothesis would adopt.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, if something could be either kind of some information or whatever can be accessed either telepathically, it can be remote viewed, it can, in any of the various methods where psi phenomena may present itself or may, be able to be used, that can kind of come under the umbrella, right?
Right. I mean, the medium, for example, might be reading the mind of the sitter. Mm-hmm. That's one reason why many people prefer to do proxy sittings with mediums, where they send someone in their stead, as if the distance matters.
Yeah, because as you said, if this thing is anywhere, if there's recorded anywhere physical, in a physical copy, if something's written down or what have you, then it's technically possible to be remote viewed or whatever, right, to be perceived.
And even more important, partisans of the survival hypothesis can't object to that kind of strategy. I mean, some survivalists like to say that the living agent psi hypothesis, this is where super comes in, the living agent psi hypothesis proposes psi of a magnitude that's simply incredible. And my response to that is twofold, maybe threefold, we'll find out. First of all, we have no idea what the limits of psi are. If our standard for deciding what counts as plausible psi among the living is what we learn from laboratory experiments, card guessing experiments, ordinary remote viewing studies, and so on, then we haven't a clue, because psi in life might be quite a different animal than psi in the lab, just as ordinary human behavior in life can be quite different from ordinary human behavior under laboratory scrutiny. Besides, survivalists have to posit just as much psi in a mediumistic setting, for example, as partisans of the living agent psi hypothesis. So, for example, a medium says, your Uncle Harry's here. He's glad you're giving up your accounting job and becoming a lion tamer. Now, the question we have to ask the survivalist is, how does Uncle Harry, deceased Uncle Harry, know that? If there is a deceased Uncle Harry, he can only get that information, presumably telepathically, from the sitter. And how does the medium know what Uncle Harry is saying? That would seem to involve telepathy between the medium and the deceased. Mm-hmm. So no matter where you turn, you're dealing with psi. The only difference between the survivalist psi and the living agent psi is their ontologies. And ordinarily, the extra ontology of the survivalist would ordinarily place the survivalist at an explanatory disadvantage, because they're positing a level of existence which the non-survivalist is avoiding. So their ontology is more complicated than that of the living agent psi partisan.
Yeah.
Did I make that clear?
I think so. I think that was a pretty thorough explanation. And if anybody is unclear, then please, ask a question in the comments or whatever, and I can respond, or I can even get in touch with Steve and ask him his thoughts. But I think you made that pretty clear. But it is it's a weird thing, right? It's a weird topic for people. It can be quite nuanced and complicated. But yeah, you did a good job explaining that. As we go today, and as we kind of jump around the various, maybe elements is a good way to say it, the various elements of the evidence for survival, I'm probably going to highlight a few that I think are particularly challenging to the LAP, the living agent psi, hypothesis, and I'd be keen to hear what you think, and likewise, if there's anything as we go that you want to bring up that because I'm sure you look at it from both sides, if there's anything that comes up that you think that is particularly challenging or hard to integrate with the living agent psi, then I'd be keen to hear that as well as we go, and if not, I will ask you about that at the end, just as in case there's anything that we missed.
Let me make one thing clear. I'm not a partisan, although I'm often characterized as a partisan of the LAP hypothesis. I just want to see clear reasoning on both sides of the debate, but usually I find the quality of reasoning abysmal.
Yeah.
I mean, my guess is you want to ask me about the chess case.
No, actually.
Oh, good.
No. I will see what I don't want to give you any spoilers, so you'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
There's a couple of things, like I could probably come up with a longer list, but I wanted to just give you, like my highlights. So hopefully they won't be too easy for you to shrug off. We'll see. But I know I always got the impression from you that you were, open-minded. Obviously you're an open-minded person and you're a deep thinker, but I always got the impression that you were open to both sides of this kind of debate, and just wanted to kind of look at it rationally and openly. And obviously everybody can kind of have a different interpretation, right? Because it's, again, it's not all empirical stuff and everything like that. And there is a large body, and obviously at a certain point, the body of evidence can kind of fill in some gaps where it's not such empirical strength, the data and whatnot. But anyway, the first element, sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, if I have a pre-theoretic preference, it would be for the survival hypothesis to be true, especially as I inch closer and closer to that great trash compactor in the sky.
Yeah. And I probably, if I had a preference, I would say I am more in the survival camp for sure. I do think there's the evidence over the body of evidence overall suggests that. I wouldn't go around saying I'm 100% confident, but I do think it's very strongly pointing towards that. Again, we'll continue to talk about it as we go, and I'm sure it could be, we could go on for hours longer than this discussing it, because it's one of those things, right? So the first element that we can discuss is something that you've studied in depth, you've researched in a lot of depth. That's physical mediumship. So maybe you wanted to say a few words about that in general, and then my first kind of question would be, how hard is it to pinpoint fraud within physical mediumship?
I'm not sure what I'd make as a general introduction to physical mediumship, except it's a body of evidence that even parapsychologists usually prefer to avoid. The received unreflective view about physical mediums is that they're all frauds. When I started getting into all of this many years ago, I was astounded to discover that the people who generally held rigid negative views about the evidence from physical mediumship actually had never even read the primary literature. They had built their opinions on secondary sources, and the authors in those secondary sources hadn't studied the primary literature either. So they were just blowing it out their ass, as we say in philosophy. I was blown away by how good the evidence was. And I personally wanted to study physical mediumship for myself because, unlike some other kinds of physical evidence, like poltergeist cases or haunting cases, it may come as no surprise to you that my philosophy department had no provisions in its budget for paranormal case investigations. So I had to usually fund them myself or ride occasionally on media's coattails. And I like the immediacy and the option of being able to video record the phenomena. So it was just a personal preference about what to study. But I still think it's an unusually strong body of evidence, and a scary body of evidence for reasons I think we discussed before. The existence of any psychokinesis at all, even just moving a matchstick by thought alone, moving it a millimeter. It's a small step conceptually from doing that to making somebody drop dead by thought alone. So the existence of any PK at all, whether it's massive or minuscule, suggests a kind of magical worldview that most of us associate, usually condescendingly, only with so-called undeveloped or primitive cultures. But it may turn out to be the case that a worldview where we have to worry about such things as hexing in the evil eye may be closer to the way things really are than what current science suggests, because current science tends to make causation more and more impersonal.
Yeah. You mentioned about video recording. That's obviously something I'd be interested in. I know lots of people watching this will probably want me to follow up with you about that. So I guess that's one of the things I'll ask you to respond to in just a moment is the video recording. I guess just respond to that first. So have you managed to video record any of the phenomena? Like, was that successful? How did you find that kind of those attempts?
My biggest success was with an Argentinian subject, Ariel Farias, who can make tables tilt, not fully levitate. And under impeccable conditions, he's a good guy. He's not a professional psychic. He has no interest in being one. He's a regular family man. He just discovered he could do this and was interested in exploring his own abilities. He's also like a classic poltergeist victim. His phenomena started when he was 10 or 11 and his father died. And it affected him profoundly, and objects were flying around, shattering, and so on. And even today, when he gets agitated, things may fly off shelves. But there are various video recordings of Ariel making tables go up. They're very good.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to hear more about Ariel, we talked about him in some detail, I think, in our first interview, and we got some of the clips of the tables and stuff. So yeah, check that out. Aside from Ariel and the table tinting, did you manage to film any like kind of more classic physical mediumship, like or how did you?
Well, I got lots of video from my study of the Felix experimental group and the medium Kai Muga. But we know Kai cheats on occasion. That's been well established. And I think there's now good reason for supposing that virtually all of his table levitations are fraudulent. Turns out that even on one that looked really good when we recorded it, Michael Nahm really has established that when Kai makes tables go up, he's actually using his thumb underneath and his leg as a fulcrum. And he's got a false thumb that you see above the table.
Oh, really?
Wow. So my view about Kai, I had high hopes for him, but I think he's just not worth the trouble. I suspect still that some of the phenomena I've experienced with him were legitimate. For example, in some table levitations that lasted 20 seconds or more, the table was floating back and forth to the rhythm of the music that was playing. Michael Nahm says he can reproduce that. I want to see that personally. But
he said he can reproduce that, yeah.
Yeah. The bottom line is that Kai's just not worth the trouble.
Yeah.
I'm saddened by that because I had high hopes. So I don't know what to say about Kai. The gold leaf lady, I did manage to catch the foil appearing on her in real time, but the evidence is compromised because on that occasion we had only one video camera. I was operating it. And when the foil appeared on Katie, she often felt an itch or an irritation in the area where the foil would appear. And she started rubbing her eye. And I thought, something's going to happen. So I zoomed in on her face, and she would go like this, rub her eye, and then look at her finger. But when she looked at her finger, she took it out of camera range. And although all the observers present knew that there was nothing already on her hand that she could have placed on her eye, at one point when she took her finger away, there was some foil under her eye. But you can't tell whether she just dipped her finger and put it on her face.
Yeah.
So it's not easy being a paranormal investigator.
No, definitely not. I'm a big fan of Michael Nahm. I've spoken to him a couple of times. And about Kai Muge, you said essentially, established fraud, but also you think some genuine phenomena really as well.
Yes, and the seances when the table was swaying back and forth, there was a bell suspended from the ceiling behind me. No one was near it, and it rang.
Yeah.
There was a drum well behind Kai, out of his reach. A very loud bang came from the drum. Kai was being controlled on both sides by my colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way he could have produced that sound. So
Yeah.
my guess is Kai is somebody who experienced some genuine phenomena and thought he could produce this, and was also corrupt enough to want to make a living out of this
Mm-hmm.
and be a
Yeah.
guru.
Yeah, which it's called like mixed mediumship, right? Like
Yes.
in the kind of industry, as it were, or in the field, and it's kind of fairly common, I guess, realistically speaking. And as you say, maybe it's about making money, maybe it's about becoming famous or whatever, or maybe it's simply this compulsion to, you know, like to put on a show, or who knows? There could be lots of kind of, I guess, factors at play as to why people feel compelled to. And I guess in some cases, maybe it's even not consciously cheating. Maybe, you know, in some circumstances, maybe they're not really even realizing what they're doing.
Well, in some cases, like Eusapia Palladino, it was
Mm,
probably the best thing she could do to earn a living. She had no other real abilities.
mm-hmm.
And ironically, it turns out because she was an admitted cheat, she even admitted she would cheat if given the chance.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, she was like, make sure you restrain me well, because if not, I will.
but ironically, that's the reason her case is so good, because
Mm-hmm.
if it hadn't been the case, then she wouldn't have been investigated under the really impeccable controls that were applied in the mediumship.
Yeah. So this is a case you're really familiar with, right? You've gone into detail on that. So that would be great. Maybe if you can talk a little bit about Eusapia Palladino, for people that maybe are not familiar with her, or people that have just heard her name in passing, maybe you can kind of give a bit of an introduction and talk about why her case is so extraordinary. You mentioned also the Gold Leaf Lady. If anybody wants to learn more about the Gold Leaf Lady, we did talk about that in much more detail in our first interview. And of course, you've written a book where she's mentioned in the title. It's called The Gold Leaf Lady.
I'm glad
But
you
yeah.
remembered what we talked about last time.
Yeah, no worries. It was fascinating. So yeah, I remember for sure. But yeah, it'd be great. Yeah, if you could talk about Eusapia
Sure.
Palladino, that'd be wonderful.
Well, Eusapia was a medium at the early part of the 20th century. And she was a peasant woman from Naples. Um, she had no particular skills except apparently her mediumship.
Mm-hmm.
And she was investigated by researchers at the Society for Psychical Research in London and various researchers on the continent. Richet, Gély, and others. There's an interesting situation. The SPR in London had a kind of unofficial policy about studying the lower form of spiritualism, PK. And their policy was, if the medium was ever caught cheating, just forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
Researchers on the continent had a different view. They recognized that she would cheat if given the opportunity, and if she didn't like her investigators. So the SPR in London decided to test Eusapia for themselves. First, they brought her to Cambridge, England, and they claimed that Eusapia was comfortable in Cambridge, that she was happy. And first of all, that's absolutely incredible. I think Victorian researchers had no idea what to do with Eusapia. She was coarse, she was unattractive, she was flagrantly sexual. She would often throw herself seductively into the lap of the nearest male sitter when coming out of a trance. And I think she really bruised Victorian sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Also, as Alan Gauld once wrote, purses and other valuables were rather too liable to dematerialize.
Right.
So what they did was they relaxed conditions, they relaxed controls, and tempted her to cheat, and she obliged. And so the folks in Cambridge were content to dismiss Eusapia's mediumship.
Mm-hmm.
And that really pissed off the investigators on the continent. They said, you haven't done this properly at all. And they challenged the SPR, and the SPR sent their three most experienced debunkers of mediums, Fielding, Bagley, and Carrington. And the so-called fraud squad went to Naples in 1908. They rented 3 adjoining rooms in a hotel. Seances were conducted in the middle room. They conducted 11 seances. I should say that all 3 of these investigators were extremely well experienced debunking mediums. 2 were skilled magicians. They knew the tricks of the trade. They knew what Eusapia's repertoire of phenomena, and they knew how to control for them. And the room was lit by an electric light, and they had a stenographer stationed there so that they could call out what their controls were at any given moment and what they were observing.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no video camera, but this led to a report that was as cinematic as anything could have been at that particular date. So, for example, if you read the Fielding, Bagley, and Carrington report on Eusapia, you'll see things like one investigator says, I'm controlling Eusapia's left foot and left arm. Another would call out, I'm controlling Eusapia's right foot and right arm. And the third would say, I'm sitting in Eusapia's lap. And then they'd all say, table levitation at a distance, table levitation at a distance, or whatever the phenomenon might have been.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, it's not terribly interesting after a while to just read these kinds of reports. The most interesting aspect of the massive report that they published, at the end of every seance, the investigators wrote down their feelings and thoughts about what they had undergone in the seance. And what you read are 3 distinct conversion experiences. All 3 investigators went to Naples expecting to debunk Eusapia once and for all. And what happened instead was they were all converted grudgingly to a belief in the reality of macro PK. Mm. And Bagley actually came after the first several seances had been conducted. And so he went through a delayed version of what Fielding and Carrington had also gone through. So when you read Fielding and Carrington's comments after the seances, when all 3 were there, you also get to read their reactions to what Bagley was going through. So that part of the report is absolutely fascinating. It's a very important document. And I should add that after the seance, they would strip Eusapia, which I'm sure she enjoyed, but they would confirm that she wasn't hiding something in her clothing or on her body. But they had over 450, I think, documented effects that they couldn't explain.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible.
It's a great case and should be studied very carefully.
Yeah. So you have all of those documents. Are they available online, like the documents to like their reports?
That I'm not sure.
Like that?
I'm not sure.
Do you have them?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I wonder if I even have electronic versions of those.
You have like hard copies?
Oh yeah, I have hard copies.
Yeah. Wow. That's cool. If you have electronic versions, I'd love it if you could send me a copy. But yeah, if not, then,
I'll check.
Yeah. Maybe it would be worth, like, if they're not online and you don't have electronic copies, maybe it'd be worth trying to get your hard copies put into electronic copies for future generations. Because as you said, it's important.
If
stuff.
I send them to you, you're willing to do that?
I can try and figure it out. Yeah, I can try and figure something out. Sure. Yeah, we'll talk about it after. We'll definitely not leave that one though, because as you said, it's important stuff, and yeah, it's really fascinating. Are there any other like incredible cases, people that you have studied in depth that I mean, I'm sure there are, but are there any others you wanted to talk about? Any others that you wanted to mention or talk a little bit about?
Well, the best case of all is that of D.D. Hume. We probably talked about him.
No, the first time we kind of left all the stuff that could be in the survival stuff. So first time it was pretty much all around the consciousness and psychic stuff and psi phenomena and all of that kind of thing. Stuff that was in Gold Leaf Lady, but we didn't get into this. No, I'm pretty sure.
The importance of Hume, this is Hume's mediumship lasted for 25 years, began around in the 1850s, I think. Hume was never caught cheating. He produced extraordinary phenomena during that 25-year period. There was a hiatus when he converted to Catholicism temporarily, and the spirits took away his abilities. Make of that what you will.
Yeah, it's interesting.
His repertoire of phenomena was extraordinary. Objects would, including very heavy objects, would levitate completely, like pianos, heavy wooden tables that would seat 14.
Wow.
People could sit on pianos and still the piano would be moved around the room. They couldn't stop the piano. Hume could walk into a room that he'd never visited before, wasn't expecting to visit, so no planned apparatus or concealed confederate. And a bookshelf would start walking toward the people who just entered the room. He would produce materialized hands that ended at the wrist. They were warm, flesh-like, mobile. People could poke holes in them with their fingers. The hole would heal. The hand would carry objects around the room. I should add that the hands were never retracted as if it had been something that he had hit on his person and was retrieving. We don't have the technology today for this. This was not a simple magician's trick. He could make accordions play untouched or held at the end away from the keys, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But he could do lots of things. If you look at my book, what's it called? The Limits of Influence. I go into the case in considerable detail. The most important thing about Hume's case is this. He was studied by, among other people, William Crookes. And Crookes was a smart guy and a very honest investigator, I think. As I said, one of Hume's phenomena was that he could make accordions play untouched. And Hume thought that the phenomena were strongest under the seance table. Now, granted, that sounds a little suspicious on the surface. But Crookes realized that if that was a sincere belief on Hume's part, there's little to be gained by forcing Hume out of his comfort zone any further than necessary. So he was also very clever. So here's what he did. First, he bought a new accordion. So it's clearly not a prop of Hume's. He went to Hume's apartment, watched him change clothes so he could determine that Hume wasn't concealing anything on his body. Although in 1871, it's not clear what kind of miniaturized concealed device this could have been. Then he took Hume to his house where he had built a cage made out of wire and wood that just fit under his dining room table. There was room for Hume to get his hand into the cage to hold the accordion at the end away from the keys. There was not enough room for him to get his hand all the way in so he could actually manipulate the accordion. His other hand was placed on the table. There were 9 observers from the Royal Society, one placed on either side of Hume to make sure he wasn't taking his feet out of his boots. Another observer with a lamp under the table. Under those conditions, the accordion was seen to move in and out. Keys were depressed, sounds came out of the accordion. And Crooks asked Hume to take his hand out of the cage, put both hands on the table. Then he ran electric current through the cage, and the accordion still flopped around inside the cage.
Really?
Now, I think this is one of the most dramatic and important experiments in the history of parapsychology. No magician has even attempted to duplicate that under anything like the conditions that Crooks imposed on Hume.
Yeah. Seemingly for the obvious reason that they wouldn't be able to, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it's just how do you even begin to, as you said, nine people around there from the Royal Society, and somebody with a lamp, and the only possible thing is that they're all in on it, right? They're all, other than
right. If you're driven to that level of explanation, then you've given up.
Yeah. No, it is extraordinary. And there's quite a few, I mean, I'm not going to say to that such level, but there's a number of really extraordinary cases in the literature with physical mediumship, right? And there's all sorts of incredible things seem to happen in these seances and that kind of thing. We could talk about it for ages. I'd be interested to hear about your personal experiences kind of sitting when genuine phenomena, as far as you can tell, has taken place. And also, are you familiar with Stuart Alexander? Have you ever sat with Stuart Alexander?
No, I've been invited, but was unable to do so. I'd like very much to do that.
Yeah. What kind of stands out to you in terms of the personal experiences you've had with physical mediums?
Well, there was a time when I would have liked to have included Kai Muga and the Felix group in there, but that's gone. Again, Ariel and Katie, the gold leaf lady, might be my two favorites. I should add that Katie was a good all-around psychic. None of her, well, she had only a first-grade education. She was functionally illiterate. She could write her name. She knew the letters of the alphabet, but she couldn't write sentences. But when she was in a mediumistic trance, she would write out quatrains in medieval French, ostensibly from Nostradamus.
Yeah. Wow.
And that was pretty nifty. I saw that a few times.
Yeah. That's wild.
If we talk about this, you'll have to remind me. She also solved crimes. She was very good at working with the police.
I think we did talk about it, but if you want to quickly kind of recap it, by all means.
I'll give you a couple examples. On one occasion, the police showed Katie a photograph of the victim of a murder. And Katie's face and arms broke out in scratch marks. Now, Katie hadn't been told this, but the victim was fleeing her assailant, and she ran through some bushes and scratched her face and arms.
Yeah.
On another occasion, there's an island off Vero Beach, Florida, John's Island, where lots of very wealthy homes, including one from King Charles. And there was a home from which hundreds of thousands of dollars of jewelry had been stolen. The head of security, whom I interviewed, had been unable to solve the case. And he heard about Katie and he figured it couldn't hurt to bring her in. Mm-hmm. So here's what he did. He brought her to John's Island, drove around the island with her. And whenever he got onto a street where there were homes, he took his foot off the gas pedal and just coasted so as not to give away which was the home in question. Katie identified the home. She described the decor inside the home. She described 3 people who committed the crime. The head of security, I thought there was just 2. She gave him so many correct details that at one point he began to regard her as a suspect. But she provided enough information that he was able eventually to solve the crime and retrieve several $100,000 of jewelry. Yeah. As they were leaving John's Island, Katie asked the driver to pull over because she said she felt nauseous. She smelled marijuana, and nobody in the car smelled pot. And she said, well, I also hear helicopters, and nobody else heard helicopters. She said, well, in 2 weeks, all this will happen. The head of security jotted this down. And then 2 weeks later, almost to the hour, 25 bales of pot washed ashore on Johns Island, and federal helicopters were circling overhead. Now, it's not unprecedented for pot to wash ashore, apparently, in Florida. But still, the cool thing is that it was almost to the hour when Katie predicted it would happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And the scratches thing is crazy too. That's it's really.
Oh, there was another
really
one. You want another one?
Sure.
She was shown, I forget if it was the gravesite or a photo of the victim, and Katie doubled over, and there was a big welt on the back of her head. Nobody had told Katie, but the victim was killed by blunt force trauma to the back of the head.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. Really fascinating. Really fascinating stuff. To go back to mediumship for a minute.
Oh, yeah, we got off track, sorry.
It's all good. Physical mediumship. Kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to physical mediumship, I suppose, even though the whole topic is already an elephant in a room, is the idea of ectoplasm. Right. So this is kind of what lots of people would say is used to create materializations. Some people would say it's what they use to move objects around the room and all of that kind of thing. What is your take on that? I guess the first question, the most obvious question is ectoplasm real? Do you think it's a real thing? Yeah, start with that.
I have to think it's a real thing. And some of the evidence is really quite compelling. One of the best ectoplasm mediums, well, two. One would be Kathleen Gallagher, an Irish medium, and another would be Eva C., Martha Barreau in France. Eva C. would, how do I want to say that? Eva C. went to extraordinary lengths to cooperate with her experimenters. She would materialize ectoplasm apparently from her mouth, but even when a veil covered her face, the ectoplasm, the stuff that she materialized, would appear outside the veil. But to make sure that she wasn't hiding something on her body, and sometimes it came out of her mouth, they would give her an emetic, so she would puke her guts out. They would give her blueberry syrup.
Right.
So, they would do full cavity search. And still, she produced ectoplasm. So it would behave organically. It would sometimes ooze out of her and then develop a little hand that waved its fingers. This was observed close at hand. Kathleen Gallagher, on the other hand, produced ectoplasm rather differently. It too would ooze out of various orifices. And here's an interesting episode, an opportunity missed. Kathleen Gallagher was studied by W.J. Crawford, a mechanical engineer. And he wondered how Kathleen was able to levitate tables. She produced a number of very dramatic physical phenomena, but he particularly wondered how she levitated the tables. And he photographed the ectoplasm in the process of levitating the table. And the ectoplasm would act as a kind of cantilever. It would come out of her body, apparently her vagina, brace itself on the floor, and then lift the table. Now, naturally, that appealed to Crawford as a mechanical engineer. It seemed to be a satisfactory explanation to him. The investigators on the continent who investigated Eva C., they were physiologists, biologists. And Eva's ectoplasm behaved more organically or biologically. Now, here's the opportunity missed. Nobody at the time was taking experimenter effects seriously. It would have been really interesting if the investigators had switched mediums to see if Kathleen Gallagher's ectoplasm behaved more organically when studied by Jaley or Richet, or shrink Nazi, and so on and so on. So that would have been very illuminating.
Yeah.
Now, today we don't have mediums of this quality. Kai ostensibly produced ectoplasm. I saw him pull lots of stuff out of his mouth. When we studied Kai in Austria, and I guess that was 2013, we had, I thought, pretty good controls. He had no access to the seance room. I had the key. I did a strip search of Kai in the presence of a doctor who confirmed that I did it properly. I didn't do a full cavity search. That's not within my pay grade. And that turns out to be relevant. So and Kai had tea, black tea, and pizza shortly before the seance. So he pulled lots of stuff out of his mouth, fell on the floor. He wouldn't let us touch it. He said it might harm the medium. Question is, where did it come from? And there are two primary hypotheses, if you're a skeptic about this. One would be he regurgitated it. And if that's the case, then why didn't we see some traces of the black tea or the pizza?
Yeah.
There's none of that.
That hypothesis would be that it was the mozzarella from the pizza, but then where's the rest of the pizza and stuff, right?
It wasn't that much mozzarella.
Exactly, you need a lot.
This was a big. The other hypothesis is the rectal hypothesis, and that might seem incredible to you, except there was a famous Hungarian medium who specialized in secreting stuff in his rectum and then reinserting it later. I suppose it's a cultivated skill. And it may be relevant in this context to note that Kai had done 3 documentaries, I think, about the drug scene in Frankfurt. So he certainly knew about drug mules who hid drugs in their rectum. So I don't know what to say. Whether Kai was able to reinsert the stuff in his mouth and re-swallow it, or reinsert it up his ass, I have no idea. One thing that was very suspicious about Kai's materialization, he didn't want anybody to touch it because, as I said, he said it would harm the medium, but it fell on the floor. So it touched the floor, and Kai was not harmed by it.
Yeah.
So it was just one of many incongruous statements that Kai made that didn't exactly strengthen the case for the genuineness of his phenomenon.
Yeah. And of course, you're familiar with Leslie Kean, an investigative journalist who wrote the book Surviving Death. I think you wrote a chapter in that book, if I'm not mistaken.
I didn't write a chapter, but
you were definitely featured in there.
She cites me all over.
Right, that's what it would be then, because it's a few years since I read it. But anyway, yeah, she writes about her experiences with Stuart Alexander, which I talked to her about, and I talked to Stuart about as well. And yeah, I mean, she claims that she saw that ectoplasm kind of forming into hands and all sorts. It's just, and I read Stuart's book, An Extraordinary Journey. I don't know if you've read that.
Yes.
But yeah, there's so many fascinating, accounts from people that have sat with him. Yeah, ectoplasm.
It's one of my disappointments that I haven't had a chance to do it.
Yeah, well, never say never, right? I mean, I know he's cut back on it a lot, but I think he is still doing the occasional. I've also got a kind of invitation. I'm just waiting for, hoping that at some point that actually comes to fruition. That would be awesome. That would be my first as well, my first time doing something like that. So when it comes to ectoplasm, you think it's real based on the evidence? Do you think it's physically real? Like in a sense, like how, in what way would you kind of describe your thoughts on it? Do you think it's physically real? Is it real in the sense that like an apparition is real? That like it's I don't know. I mean, it does manipulate the physical world, right? Seemingly.
Well, yes. Can you touch it? Apparently, one can.
And as you say, have a medium potentially. Yeah.
Well, Carlos Mirabelli in Brazil produced apparent full form materializations in broad daylight.
Mm-hmm.
People could touch the object, who would then just dissolve in their grasp, like Hume's materialized hands. People could shake hands with it, and as I said, poke holes in it and so on. So apparently it is physically real. It can move objects.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wild. I know you're not a biologist, but do you you must have thought about it and, you know, speculated in your own mind. Like, do you think that's something that everybody has the ability to produce in some way, or do you think it's just, you know, a select few individuals? Yeah, have you kind of thought about that?
Well, I think about psi abilities generally. It's like, perhaps in certain ways, it's like musical or athletic abilities. There are people who are virtuosi, and then there's everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And they fall along a continuum of virtuosity, I guess, which is what I think we would expect. I see no reason why psi abilities would be radically discontinuous from most of the other things that we can do.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. It's just so hard, isn't it? This ectoplasm thing. It feels different to psi abilities in general because it's got that physical element to it. Maybe that's what the appendix is for, after all. Maybe it's not just like digesting grass or whatever they said it was for.
Well, it looks so obnoxious. I mean, if you see some of these pictures of ectoplasm, huge sheets of it coming out of a person's mouth, it's just ooh.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And apparently it can also, again, I've never seen this myself, but there are, in the literature, in some cases it can come like out of the sternum and, you know, other areas, right?
Yes.
Which again is just bizarre.
Yeah, I still don't know what to say about it, except that I wish I saw more.
Yeah. And again, I guess your last word would be that based on all of the stuff you've read and seen, as far as you're concerned, it's a real physical, at least in some sense, phenomenon.
Yes. It's not the way I would like the evidence to be. I wish it were stronger, but I think it's much better than people appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
Investigators were smart in the past, just as they are now. We can't dismiss it by appealing to a kind of argument from technology. I mean, 19th century methods for detecting fraud in physical mediumship was adequate for what was possible to produce in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I think about that. We can't just dismiss it on the grounds that technology for exposing fraud was too crude in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to kind of wrap up our part of this discussion where we're focusing on the physical mediumship, I wonder why you think it doesn't point towards the survival hypothesis. Do you think there are any elements of it that do suggest that the survival hypothesis, such as obviously like Stuart Alexander, we mentioned him, he's always keen to remind that like the most important parts, or some of the most important parts of the phenomena that occurs with his seances and things like that are the kind of communications from people, apparently deceased loved ones. What are your thoughts on that? And one thing that I think is a particularly kind of challenging or problematic for the super psi hypothesis in this context would be the drop-in communicators, which I'm sure you've kind of, you know, you're familiar with that, and I'm sure you have your thoughts on that. But what do you make of them? How do you integrate drop-in communicators, such as the case of Emil Jensen? I think it was in Driddy and Dridson. I mean, again, you probably know this case. How do you integrate the idea of drop-in communicators with the living agent psi hypothesis?
Well, there's a lot in that question.
Yeah. 12
um,
questions in one. It's my specialty.
First of all, insofar as the phenomena are physical, it's irrelevant to the survival hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Of course.
About drop-in communicators. My personal favorite is the case of Runke's leg.
Yes, I see. That's a great, yeah.
And the reason people take drop-ins seriously is because the phenomena seem to make most sense from the perspective of the drop-in.
Mm-hmm.
Do I need to try to remember the details of the case of Runke's leg? I could probably.
If you want to, that would be great, but no pressure. Like, if not,
well, consider this a test. The medium in question is Hafstein Bjornsson, probably Iceland's greatest mental medium. He was a trance medium. And in, I think it was 1937, he was holding a seance in somebody's home, a bunch of people around, and a drop-in appeared. They asked, "What's your name?" He said, "What the hell does it matter to you what my name is?" And they said, "What do you want?" He said, "I'm looking for my leg." And they kept asking for his name, and he kept refusing to give it. At one point, he grudgingly gave a clearly phony name, the Icelandic equivalent of something like John Smith. So they knew it was BS. But he kept demanding that they help him find his leg, which he said was in the sea. This just went on for a while. Then the seance moved locations to another home and a slight change in personnel. What was the name? Including a sitter named Ludwig Gudmundsson, who had a home in a fishing village about 6 kilometers from Reykjavik, a place called Sangerdi. And to everybody's surprise, the drop-in reappeared and said he was glad that Ludwig was there because now he claimed his remains were in Ludwig's house. Well, this came as a surprise to Ludwig. And they said, "Well, we'll help you find your leg, but you have to tell us who you are." And apparently the drop-in had a hissy fit about this and left the scene for 6 months. And apparently he thought it over. And 6 months later, he reappeared at a seance and decided to tell his story. And the story he told was that his name was Runolfar Runolfsson. He lived about 6 kilometers from Sangerdi, and he was a heavy drinker. He had been walking home drunk one night and stopped off at a friend's house where there was a party going on, and he had some more to drink. And at one point, then he decided he'd continue walking home, which apparently, the other party guest said, "Well, somebody should go with you as a designated walker." And he apparently refused, and they were apparently happy to let him go. So off he went. And he was walking home in the rain. And at one point, he was tired, and he sat down on a rock to have a drink from the flask that he carried with him. And he fell asleep on the rock. The tide came in and washed him out to sea, where he drowned. And his body was washed back on shore, where it was torn to pieces by dogs and ravens. And the bones were eventually retrieved, except for a femur. And Runke said, that was his nickname, Runke. Runke said it was important to find the femur and give it a proper burial. And he said it was in Ludwig's house. And Ludwig asked around in his village, and some of the locals said, "Well, a while ago, her leg had been going around," and they couldn't remember where it was. And finally, Ludwig found someone who remembered placing a femur in the wall of Ludwig's house. Now, time out. You might wonder, what's all this about a fascination with one's bones, one's remains? I was assured by Erlander Haraldson that this is not unusual for residents of Iceland to place great importance on giving one's remains a proper burial. So they tore down the wall and found a femur that was clearly the femur of a tall person. Now, they could never fully associate this with Runke because Runke's grave was unmarked. Runke said, all this can be confirmed if you look at the church record book in Utskalar. So it turns out graves in Utskalar are unmarked and stacked on top of one another. So there's no way to tell what remains are those of Runke. Now, what's interesting about this case, apart from just the peculiarity of it, is that in order to confirm the various items in Runke's story, they weren't all from the same source. They located Runke's grandfather, who confirmed that he was tall. Some elements of the story were indeed found in the Utskalar church book. There was also an unpublished manuscript in the National Library that told the story and had other elements. So if the living were getting this psychically or non-psychically, they'd have to go to several obscure sources, whereas the survivalists tell a neater story, just has to come from Runke. There are some nagging concerns about the case. Oh, but I should mention, it has a kind of happy ending. Ludwig built a coffin for the femur and gave it a proper burial. There was a church service, the choir sang, they served tea and cakes. And Runke later had a seance, came and said he had attended his femur service and he was satisfied. And although he had been an annoying communicator before this, he sort of mellowed out and became a kind of benign control person. So what are the concerns? One was that Hafstein had actually gone to the National Library and had signed in. So we don't know what that's about. I had some other nagging concerns. I wish I could remember them. One thing that bothered me was, first, Runke said his leg was in the sea. Then he said it was in Ludwig's house.
Yeah.
And if he knew where to locate it in Ludwig's house, why couldn't he help him find the grave, the rest of his remains? So there are these nagging concerns about the case. It's not a clean case, but it's about as good as a drop-in case gets to be. And it illustrates, nevertheless, the important point that a survivalist explanation of a drop-in case makes optimal sense psychologically if you do a good job of ruling out what motives the living might have. And one of the weaknesses I find in the survival literature is that a crucial question almost never gets asked. And the question is, whose interests are being served by the appearance of evidence for survival? Even in cases where the investigators are psychiatrists like Ian Stevenson, I think Ian Stevenson's reincarnation material is shockingly superficial psychologically. When he describes what's going on in the minds of the living, he portrays the living as psychological stick figures. They have no robust inner life. And unless you really are going to look deeply into the psychology of people who have some vested interest in the appearance of evidence for survival, you don't know what in the hell is going on. So in my book, Immortal Remains, I take a very close look at the case of Sharada, which seems to be a case of responsive xenoglossy, speaking an unknown language. It's a very complex case. I can't do that one from memory. I'm sorry. But what I think I do clearly show is that Stevenson grossly underestimates what the interests of the living were in this case. And so I would extend that to drop-in cases too. I think in general, the treatment of the living psychologically is just very superficial.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree, though, that essentially like cases like Runke's leg, and are you familiar with the Emil Jensen case?
Yeah, not as familiar.
Yeah, I did. I think I recited it kind of in one of my interviews a while back, maybe with Leslie Kane, maybe in another one. But yeah, I won't try and remember all that now either, because I'll end up going back and forwards and missing bits, and then, oh yeah, that bit. But either way, I find that kind of up there with that case in terms of how much information and the bizarreness of the drop-in and how it was all kind of cobbled together years later via different avenues and different researchers, and kind of only then, like decades later, did it seem to be so strong. But again, do you think those cases kind of in isolation are more suggestive of survival? Because as you said, like in terms of the motivation behind these things, like it does seem like if we're saying that is kind of telepathy or remote viewing or, you know, psychic phenomena at work, the big question is like, why is, obviously, as you said, like we don't know the motivation of the living in these cases in depth, but realistically, it feels to me more of a stretch to say that those cases would be, purely psychic phenomena of the living rather than something along the lines of the survival hypothesis. Do you agree that it's more of a stretch for those ones particularly to fit into the living agent psi? And do you think they fit a little bit easier in with the survival hypothesis? Yeah,
maybe so, but not as clear as, for example, the heart-lung transplant case.
Yeah, which I definitely want to circle back to that. That's
those,
definitely one.
I mean, those are cases where it's easy to make a clear connection to who the deceased seems to be and who's got an interest or not in the appearance of survival.
Yeah, I can't wait for you to elaborate on that, because that is something I'm very intrigued about. That I don't think I'd really heard about that before I was researching for this interview. So that's something I'm really keen to hear you talk about. But yeah, drop in communicators. We'll leave it there. But I think really fascinating. And as I said, I do think it's, and I don't think you disagree, even if you're not making it, not going one way or another with any certainty. I mean, I'm not with certainty either, but I think you'll agree that they are a particularly problematic element, at least for the like living agent psi hypothesis. So you mentioned in there Ian Stevenson and his research. This is obviously, I wanted to talk to you about the phenomenon of children who seem to recall memories of previous lives. I think in your 2021 BICS essay, the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, you said that you're no longer as enthusiastic about this area of evidence. Firstly, can you elaborate on why that is the case?
Yes, what I call the problem of investigative intricacy. They're needlessly messy cases. I mean, you have no choice really, but I mean, it takes a lot of work. First of all, establish who the previous personality is from the clues provided by the subject. You may need to rely on interpreters or translators whose motives may not be transparent, whose hidden agendas may be to frustrate the investigation, or who may be biased in favor of certain results. It requires, first of all, you need to get what I call early bird statements made by relevant people before the previous personality is identified.
Yeah.
then you have to interview whatever remaining relevant people are still alive and get confirmation of the details about the previous personality. So a great deal of investigative work has to be done simply to establish solidly a connection to some particular previous individual. Whereas other cases, like just ordinary mental mediumship, are much cleaner in that respect. So when a medium says, your Uncle Harry is here, and Uncle Harry transmits something that is intimate and known only to the sitter, there is, again, a very clear, apparently direct link between the living and the deceased. And you get a clear link in transplant cases too, but you don't get that in reincarnation cases. So there are many places where reincarnation cases can be weak. The interviews with the relevant remaining friends or relatives of the previous personality may be superficial. They may be hampered by careless translation or God knows what. So it's not that they can't be impressive and interesting, and I think some of them clearly are.
Yeah.
But if you're going to choose some collection of cases to study to get a good handle on what's really suggesting survival of bodily death, why go for the complex cases? I mean, I think they deserve to be studied, but there are too many potential weak spots in the reincarnation cases. And I should also say that in a lot of these cases, relevant bodies of secondary literature are never studied. This is of particular importance in cases of apparent xenoglossy, because it turns out that the people who think the evidence for speaking an unlearned language are strong don't know anything about the relevant studies of language proficiency and even what counts as language proficiency. There isn't just one thing that counts as language proficiency. Also, other relevant bodies of literature need to be studied. And this is where what I call the unusual suspects matter, because you need to study literature on dissociation, multiple personality in particular, because one of the things we know from those cases is that under, good dissociators can manifest abilities that would otherwise not have appeared at all. Good hypnotic subjects are the same, and usually multiples of good hypnotic subjects. It's also relevant to study the literature on prodigies and savants. The importance of prodigies is that they have remarkable abilities that emerge prior to any practice.
Yeah.
And their skills, the initial impressive skills of prodigies, are way beyond the kinds of skills we find in subjects in reincarnation cases. The importance of studies of savants is that they have remarkable abilities that are radically discontinuous with their considerable deficits. So one well-known savant is spastic until he sits down to play the piano. Calculating savants might be able to factor any number you give to them, but they can't add the change in their pocket. So we have no idea what's going on in these cases. And there's a vast literature on prodigies and savants that needs to be mastered before you can draw any competent conclusions about what to say about apparent abilities, like barely speaking an unlearned language, which is what we get in the usual xenoglossy case. And so I find that much of the empirical literature on survival is actually empirically myopic. It's It's not demonstrating any command of the relevant bodies of literature and science. And it's theoretically very naive.
Mm-hmm. If we say throughout, this is harsher than I think I would be in reality, but if we were going to be really harsh, just hypothetically speaking, and throughout, say, 90% of the cases from the approximately 3,000 on the books at the Division of Perceptual Studies, we're left with 50, maybe 100, somewhere in between their cases. Just the strongest ones, let's say the absolute strongest cases. And we could even boil that down to 10, 20, the absolute top of the top, the best cases, the strongest cases. How do you kind of explain them? Do you, in terms of the living agent side? I'm assuming you don't think they're all explainable via the ordinary, the usual suspects, as you call it. So how does living agent psi work? It's explain these cases in your mind.
Well, for identifications, for example, when the child, for example, is brought to the village of the previous personality and identifies people,
mm-hmm.
and those people confirm it, there's already a context for telepathic interaction. Maybe the person being identified is eager to be identified. And who knows if that facilitates connection with the child.
Yeah.
In one case, Fish and Chand, I think, the child is described as weeping bitterly when he's brought to the village and sees the shabby condition that his mistress in a former life had been living. Now, if that's an accurate description, then that's a big if. It's an interesting reaction in a child. If the child really wept bitterly, that has a different presentation than weeping in pain or just childlike crying. It has, I don't know, I lack the words for describing what bitter weeping would sound like.
Yeah, let's not do an impression now. But yeah, I can imagine.
I'll spare you that. Yes. So that interests me. But in any case, the child being brought to the previous personality's village opens up various good contexts for ESP. What about the birthmarks? I hear you.
Yeah.
Obviously,
birthmarks combined with all of these other things, not just standalone, because obviously that wouldn't hold much water. Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure what to say about that, I admit. But we don't understand on the survival hypothesis how the birthmarks are produced. So I'd say it's a standoff on that. So again,
I like the way. Sorry.
I forget now what I was going to say.
Oh, that's my fault. I'll jump in. Maybe it'll remind you. I was going to jump in and say, on the birthmarks and in terms of the survival, Ed Kelly, I think it was him that kind of put me onto this way of thinking, was saying that maybe it's kind of the idea of the emotional trauma of the previous personality, so it's not always, as you'll know probably from your research, it's not always the most physically obvious trauma that they had on their body that shows up in the form of a birthmark or defect. It's often something that may not, maybe like the second or third, most obvious thing on the body. So maybe it's some things that were particularly traumatic and that really stuck in the mind, the consciousness of the previous person. Does that jog your memory of what you were saying? Or if not, what do you think about that?
It's interesting. It's intriguing. And I think there are plenty of intriguing features of the good reincarnation cases. At one time, I thought that they were stronger than they are, but the problem of investigative intricacy now seems to me to be more of an obstacle than I had regarded it initially. So I don't want to dismiss the evidence from reincarnation cases. It's part of the overall survival stew, as it were. It's just not the strongest. Again, I would rather have more or follow-up studies of the transplant cases. I hate to keep dragging you back there, but
no, and I've got it written down, so we're definitely coming back to that for sure. Okay. And we're going to give it some time. But before we do, just a few more things on the, these cases of reincarnation cases, or to put it, a different way, children who seem to recall memories of past lives is a more gentle way of saying it. But yeah, so the birthmarks, we've touched on that. I also think there's other elements that are challenging to the living agent psi in these cases. And I do think these cases are really compelling. I think they are one of the stronger elements of the survival evidence, even though, as you say, there are lots of issues with them, sure. But I think that's kind of part of the nature of the cases, is that they happen out there in the wild. And again, we could go on a long discussion about the reasons for the messiness and how that could be avoided, but also why that's an essential, the nature of them. But yeah, one of the elements that I think is, again, maybe how you wrestle that with the living agent psi hypothesis is, you talked about skills, but I also think that fears, phobias, preferences, these kind of things, and the play, like children like doing play related to this previous personality that potentially has been identified via a combination of, statements, what have you, birthmarks, other things along these lines, maybe identifying as well. As you said, we can say about the identifying, and you made a good point about that if somebody wants to be identified, they can surely give off something. Why not? But then when you add all these things together, what are your thoughts on the fears, phobias, play, preferences, that kind of stuff? Because
well, that's exactly the kind of stuff that makes those cases as compelling as they are. How would phobias be conveyed to the child? I actually think they can. We learn patterns of behaving from our families. And more specific things can be explained in principle by telepathic influence. We don't really understand the details of how children end up being so much like their parents. I think there's a messy empirical picture there too. And it's not just learned patterns of behavior. It might be something more
like epigenetics and stuff like that. Yeah, absolutely. Again, you're right there that they are really compelling and fascinating areas, because as much as you can transmit stuff, you can transmit a phobia. Like some of these phobias are really visceral and from a really young age, and in some cases seemingly like they're kind of out of the blue, like they don't fit with maybe the upbringing of the child and things like that. Some of the things that I think are like we've obviously mentioned birthmarks, and then the fears, phobias, preferences, play. I think maybe the most difficult thing for the living agent psi hypothesis to wrangle with, or to fit into that hypothesis, is how emotionally attached these children are to, again, not in all cases, but in some of these cases, how emotionally attached they are, how they don't just have the memories. It's not like they're just kind of psychically picking them up and regurgitating them, but they truly like deeply identify with them on a really visceral, emotional level. And it's like, they can be crying like, you're not my parents, or I really want to see my real mummy, or what have you, and I want to go back to my other house, and like on that real deep level. And again, there's a child psychologist, I can't remember her name now, I think something Tova. She was quoted in a recent article in the Washington Post saying that children very seldom would make up something about parents and think they have imaginary friends, but about parents, and to have this kind of emotion about like making something up that you're not my parent, and at the same time crying and being terribly emotional. So I find that aspect of it maybe
me too. That's why I said about Bish and Chan weeping bitterly.
Yeah, exactly. But yours was in relation to going to the place, right? Whereas I'm saying in general, like just out of the blue, they could bring up
I
the
see.
idea of like,
Yes.
oh, you're not my mum, and it's kind of the same ballpark, but it's more
Right.
out of the blue, more spontaneous, like is the word I'm looking for. So yeah, it's just how attached they are, how emotionally they identify, and this true identification, rather than I have these things, I'm saying these things that, oh, that sounds like you could have been this person in another life. It's like, I am, that's me, instead of just picking them up. So again, I know we're kind of in, speculation and discussion territory, but what do you make of that as in regards to the living agent psi?
I agree with you that I think this is one of the features of a good reincarnation case that is most challenging for the LAP hypothesis. So
Yeah.
I'm with you all the way.
Cool. Well, I'm glad to hear it. Another aspect of this whole body of evidence that I don't want to spend too long on, I just want to kind of touch on it. I feel like it would be a disservice to not mention it at all, is near-death experiences. And I'm going to kind of skip a lot of that and say especially cases where people gain knowledge or information sometimes about people who have died that they could not have known otherwise. You probably know the case. I can't remember the names of anybody involved, but it was Bruce Grayson that told me about this case where it's like somebody's on the hospital ward and it's like a nurse takes the weekend off or something, and she gets given a red sports car for her birthday by her parents and crashes it and dies. And this guy that she was talking to on the ward has a near-death experience and then tells people on the ward like, oh, like where this lady, this nurse that I can't remember the name or anything, but oh, she's dead, like I saw her in my near-death experience, something like that. And they're all like, what, like she's not dead, she's on her weekend off and stuff, and then they get the news later on that she did die in this accident. So like there's cases like that I find really interesting. What are your thoughts on near-death experiences in general, I guess, first of all?
Well, in general, there's the real problem of time stamping.
Mm-hmm.
We can't really know when the NDE occurs. I mean, what most people who are impressed by the near-death cases regard as important is that apparently if the time stamping is accurate, there is mental activity going on under conditions that we ordinarily think will not support mental activity.
Yeah.
But all that follows from that is that we may have been wrong about what are the ordinary conditions for sustaining mental activity. We can't infer from that mental activity can occur independently of biological activity. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's important about near-death experiences that people come back. They're not dead. I mean, they were resuscitated. So presumably there's some residual biological activity that made that possible.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose in cases like, like the tennis shoe, I think it was a tennis shoe, like, on the ledge, the shoe on the ledge, and things like that, where there's something that's observed, I suppose you would say that could easily be some essentially like an out-of-body experience, which would fit with the living agent side, that could basically be induced by a traumatic state or something like that.
Sure. I mean, granted, whatever's going on inside the person who had the near-death experience, it's an exotic state that not everybody experiences. And we don't know what the necessary conditions for ordinary biological conditions for ordinary mental functioning are, much less optimal mental functioning. Mm-hmm. There's an assumption in the NDE literature that under the conditions that the subject is in when having an NDE, that it wouldn't support heightened mental functioning. But we don't know that. I mean, it may be that under biologically stressful conditions, it's more likely to have heightened kinds of mental episodes. I mean, so there's an enormous uncharted territory there that we're just speculating about what's going on.
Yeah. And of course, you don't need to be near actual physical death to have something along the lines of these experiences. Like they can happen where you go through, a particularly traumatic in an emotional sense experience or something like that.
That's right.
So I guess that's interesting too. But yeah, the cases, so like the case I mentioned with the sports car and the nurse who died, I suppose you could say, like, if you're trying to, think of it from other angles, you could say that just, he was able to access the information of her crash via remote viewing, something like that.
Something like that. Or, I mean, who knows what leads a person to whatever is being discovered clairvoyantly or telepathically. I mean, sometimes the road signs, as it were, are pretty clear. But we don't even know what it means for something to be psychically obscure. I mean, we talk about information being obscure, but our ordinary notion of obscurity applies to normal forms of information acquisition. We say that information is obscure when it's at a great distance or behind barriers or difficult to access in some other way. But information accessed clairvoyantly is information that's obscure in the normal sense. So I had something I was going to say there. Forgot it. Sorry.
Forgiven. All good. You've already regurgitated so much incredible information today. I'm eternally grateful. Another thing about NDEs before we move on, I just kind of thought it was worth mentioning again. I don't think it's near the same level as the stuff about the children with the past life memories, the emotional identification and attachment to their memories. But I find it interesting nonetheless, like the changes people undergo kind of post NDE, like these radical changes in personality and outlook, and the fact that they kind of, this happens overwhelmingly to the vast, I think, majority of people that have these experiences. They have this kind of new knowing. They use this word all the time, this knowing that death is not the end. They lose their fear of death. The fear of death kind of, but essentially dissipates or reduces to a very low level. Does that? What do you think of that?
I wouldn't make too much of it. I mean, granted, if you're not sophisticated about the issues and you have an NDE, it's all too easy to interpret it at face value. And of course, it's going to be very moving and life-changing. So ignorance can be bliss.
Yeah. I think there are plenty of compelling cases again that are suggestive of survival, but I don't think there's any that again are on the same level as the stuff that we were talking about just before. Like there's some cases where people find out information that they didn't know, and then that the person they ask in their family to verify doesn't know either, and then only after weeks of looking around for the information are they able to verify. But as you said at the start, if that information is written down or anywhere physical or in somebody's mind, it's accessible via the kind of super or unlimited or living agent psi hypothesis. So I'm not going to bother going into any of those cases for now. I'm going to read something that I took from the Psi Encyclopedia. Braude's conclusion about the evidence for survival is perhaps a bit less certain in his Bix essay than it was 18 years previously in Immortal Remains, though it is not easy to tell given how qualified his conclusions are in both cases. However, perhaps this sentence from the final paragraph of his Bix essay best sums up his most recent views on the matter. Even if the best actual evidence does not warrant a reassuring confidence in the reality of survival, at the very least it encourages optimism on the matter. So my question would be, are you more or less sure now than when you wrote Immortal Remains? And does that sentence still kind of accurately sum up your views?
To some extent, it still depends on what day you ask me, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's fairly accurate.
Yeah.
Now, is that
Would you,
because I'm getting closer to that great trash compactor in the sky? I don't know. Yeah,
do you
I
find
don't.
yourself leaning more towards the survival as you put it, get closer to the great, put it so eloquently, the great trash compactor in the sky? Do you find yourself like leaning more towards that? And do you must question yourself, is it out of hope, or how do you find that, like the process of aging and medical problems, how do you find that affects your thoughts on all of this?
I I try to keep it as objective as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no doubt, I would like to think that there's some kind of personal continuance, so I can still possibly harass the living. Um, I mean, my views have changed to some extent since Immortal Remains. I mean, in Immortal Remains, I gave more weight to the reincarnation cases than I do now.
Mm-hmm.
And I give more weight now to the transplant cases. Um, and maybe less weight even today from Mrs. Piper's case. I'm not sure. Um, so it's a moving target. I don't know
Yeah.
what else to say.
Were you always somebody that was kind of scared of death? I mean, obviously everybody has at least a little bit of that kind of fear of the unknown, fear of what's going to happen. Where would you kind of evaluate yourself on that? Like, have you always been somebody? I personally, I'm not afraid to say that I've always been pretty afraid of death, much less so after reading the research and realizing that there is, at least as you say, at the very minimum, reasonable grounds for optimism. But yeah, where would you kind of stand on that in terms of the fear of death
My various
historically?
my various fears or phobias about the unknown and the paranormal have been battered into submission over the years. Uh, no, I'm not particularly uh, afraid of death. I'm curious.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I get I hope some kind of continued consciousness occurs so I can enjoy the ride.
Yeah, but you lean more towards that it's not. That's to kind of get your.
I'm still on the fence, but
Are you
I
like a
said,
50-50 on the fence, or do you have a
no,
slight, tilting one way?
it depends on which way the wind is blowing. I don't,
What about today with the current wind today?
oh boy. Uh,
I did the same thing to Gregory Shushan, who really didn't want to give me his leaning on on that day. And if you don't want to, it's fine. If you want to stay totally on the fence, I understand.
no, I'm happy to give you an answer, but it's not accessible to quick introspection. Uh, I'm the more I look at the transplant cases, the more interested I become.
Hmm. Which leads me perfectly to my next question, I suppose. So this, I also took this from the Science Encyclopedia, so another quote here. Braude also discusses a relatively recent phenomenon involving organ transplants that appear to transmit memories and preferences from donor to recipient. Braude argues that transplant cases cannot be neatly categorized as either cases of reincarnation or possession, but his provisional recommendation is to view them as supplementing the evidence for possession. So can you please, elaborate on that phenomenon and about these cases and about why, that makes you kind of tilts maybe the balance a little bit towards survival, or at least threatens to do so?
Well, first of all, it's quite clear whose interests would be involved if we're looking at the transplant cases. Both the family of the donor and the family of the recipient have psychologically transparent interests in what's going on. So, for example, in one case, the donor was a young woman, a lesbian artist, painter. And the organ recipient was a young man. And after the surgery, he suddenly found himself interested in art. He spent a lot of time hanging out in art galleries, just looking at painting. He started carrying a purse. His girlfriend was shocked that he liked to go shopping. She said, I think, there's like going out with one of the girls.
Right.
And she also said his lovemaking was totally different. It suggested a knowledge of female anatomy he'd never demonstrated before.
Yeah.
And he himself said he feels he understands female anatomy better than he did before. In another case, the donor was a 17-year-old Black violinist who was killed in a drive-by shooting. And the recipient was a 47-year-old white foundry worker. He suddenly found himself after surgery interested in classical music. He would listen to it all the time. He had no idea, he was certain it had nothing to do with the operation, because he said a Black man from the hood wouldn't have been listening to classical music. His wife said he's not a bigot, but for the first time, he invited his Black colleagues from work over to the house. So all of this was inexplicable to him. In another case, the donor was a young child and the recipient was a young child. The donor's name was Jerry, I think, and the recipient was Carter. When Carter was first introduced to the donor's father, he ran to him and nuzzled up to him and said, "Daddy." And everybody was shocked by that. And what Carter said was that, "Don't worry, I'm okay. That was Jerry who did that. I just let him do it." And I find that particularly interesting because it's all too easy to brush that off and think it's just due to the child's imagination. Mm-hmm. But we already know from anthropological studies that children do better at psi tasks when they're younger than when they're somewhat older and have already started to internalize cultural taboos against having certain kinds of experiences. So one charitable view of what happened in the Carter and Jerry incident is that young Carter experienced Jerry as tagging along with him, and as like a case of dissociative identity disorder. He could just stand aside and let Jerry take over, just as one alter personality can stand aside and make room for another to take executive control of the body.
Mm-hmm. Or even seemingly in physical mediumship, sometimes the medium can kind of do that, right? Step aside, yes, and let the control come in. Yeah.
So I find that very suggestive. I wish there was a follow-up to that case. Wish there were more such cases. Trouble now is, now that there's a little literature on transplant cases, they're not so pure. They wouldn't be so pure as they were initially. But still, there's room there for investigation. I wish more cases of transplants were conducted. I'm not going to do it. But so I like that feature of the Carter and Jerry case. And it may give the clue it's one of the reasons I think of it as a kind of possession, where the deceased are just, instead of, as in haunting cases, hovering around a location, they're hovering around their continuing vital organs.
Yeah.
You know, some people like to explain the transplant cases by appealing to cellular memory. I actually think that's a philosophical non-starter. Memory can't be analyzed that way in terms of traces of whatever kind. That's one of my unpopular philosophical views, but I think it's absolutely right. And besides, explaining the transplant cases in terms of cellular memory is explaining it away as a paranormal phenomenon. Well, not entirely. What I want to say is it's not a case of survival if it's explained in terms of cellular memory. It's not a case of bodily death. It's a case of considerably altered bodily existence. It's greatly limited bodily existence.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And that's interesting. And those are fascinating cases. And as you say, I wish there was more research on that, but I guess that's an opportunity for somebody to take on those cases.
Yes, I really wish it would happen, but I'm not sure who's qualified. And I'm not sure if hospitals are even keeping track of such things.
Yeah.
You'd think they would after the initial flurry of interest. But there may be 2 books on this.
Okay. How many cases are you aware of, like along those lines? Is it just kind of a handful, or
maybe 2 dozen, or maybe a dozen? I don't even know.
Yeah, yeah. And the way you kind of think of it, again, when you kind of think of it along the lines of the survival hypothesis, you think about it as potentially this kind of discarnate consciousness, hanging around because essentially, obviously, has a vested interest now in this person because it has parts of its physical self living there, rather than, as you say, nothing to do with like cellular memory or anything like that. It's a case of being interested, and so hence.
I just throw that out there as a
of course, like
the hover hypothesis.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's as good a hypothesis as any, and like I mean, really interesting stuff. So for you, that is potentially the strongest element of the evidence that is suggestive of survival?
What I like about it is that the line to the deceased is very clear. No speculation about that. You're often getting very deep kinds of behaviors that are associated with the deceased, like the Carter Jerry case. Again, when Carter was introduced, Carter's family was staying with Jerry's family at one point, and in the middle of the night, Carter went in to sleep with Jerry's parents and nuzzled up to them the way he used to. And the first time he saw Jerry's mother, he ran up to her, hugged her, and nuzzled his nose against her in the way that young Jerry used to do.
Wow.
This is not stuff relying on testimony as in mediumship cases or reincarnation cases. These are very telltale and subtle behavioral correspondences.
Yeah. And the family or the person that receives the recipient of the organ or organs, are they told much detail about
No.
No. So like it's not like they're given a piece of paper like this is the bio of the person that gave you that organ.
No, the foundry worker
shopping.
The foundry worker who knew he had received a black person's heart.
Yeah.
That's all he knew, that it was from a black person.
Yeah, nothing about violin or music or anything.
No. He just was worried that his penis would grow.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they are fascinating though. And do you know, was it different organs in all of those cases? Was it,
they were heart or lung transplants.
Yeah. Yeah. But I suppose there's, again, if it is something to do with survival phenomena, there's no reason to suggest which organ it would impact it. But obviously, heart and lung are like, yeah,
those are vital organs.
Two of the big three, I guess. They're pretty important. Yeah, super fascinating. Again, it's something I hadn't really come across, or maybe I'd kind of heard of it, but never like read into it much before, researching for this interview. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. And I look forward to reading more about it. Do you know have you got any, do you know the books off the top of your head? Is it worth kind of suggesting any, places people can go for further research on that?
Well, you've got my Bix paper. Check the references in Immortal Remains. I can't do better than that at the moment.
Yeah, all good. Okay. And so you mentioned that you think possession, is kind of this there or thereabouts in terms of the explanation. So what are your thoughts on possession itself? In general, what do you make of that?
I don't have I'd like to say I have a position, but I don't. Ironically, the transplant cases have made me more open to the possession hypothesis.
Yeah.
I haven't put all that together. Come back next year.
Good. Yeah. Okay. And I guess to go back to my idea of a gauge of where are you leaning? I asked you earlier about the survival versus living agent psi. If I was to say specifically on those transplant cases, where would that dial be pointing? How far? I get the impression it's pointing into the survival hypothesis. Yes. How far is it pointing in there? Are we talking 55% to 45, 75% stronger? How strong do you feel about that? Approximately, obviously, and I'm not going to hold you to this, but just roughly
57.5%.
Okay, I like that. That's strong without being too strong. That's good. Other than that, which other standalone aspects of the evidence for survival, other than that and any other things we might have mentioned, what stands up for you as things that are the most challenging or problematic for the living agent psi? Is there anything we haven't touched on today that you think, that is something that I find hard to integrate with the living agent psi hypothesis?
I don't think so. I think you've done a really good job at this section. So cool. I'm going to have to rethink a few things too.
Well, next year when we do another one, we'll kind of do the update on it, and you can tell me if then what are the challenges, or maybe you will have changed your stance entirely, and I'll be the one defending the living agent side.
Sure, we can trace my intellectual development, such as it is.
So with all of that said, to kind of we have done bits of speculation, although most of this has been evidence based. With all of it said, where do you kind of, in terms of now, the reason I say that, the reason I preface it with that is because I want more of a kind of speculative, more of your personal kind of thoughts and opinions and beliefs, if you want to use that word. What do you think happens after we die? How do you have any kind of speculation? Do you have any thoughts in your mind as to how that's going to play out and what's going to happen?
I wish I had an answer for you. It would be nice to get my hair back.
Yeah, well, I mean, lots of the evidence, lots of the accounts would suggest that you might, right? Because it's that you'll get your ideal in your prime, that kind of thing.
Well, I'll tell you, I used to know the psychic Olga Worrell when I lived in Baltimore, and one day I was playing piano at her house for a bunch of people, and there came a loud crashing sound from the piano. And also the sound as if a low string had been forcibly plucked. Now, there was nothing on the piano that had that could have caused either of those sounds. Didn't seem connected to what I had played. It was a Schubert impromptu. So I didn't see the point there. And I said to Olga, half jokingly, is anyone sitting next to me on the piano bench? And she said, no, dearie, but your grandfather's behind you, your mother's father. And I said, well, can you describe him? And she said, he's broad. I said, okay. And she said, and he has a beard. I said, well, he never used to have a beard. And she says, well, he does now. He can have a beard if he wants. Yeah. So That's my hope for the afterlife, that we can
Are
be
you going to
our
go for a
prime.
beard?
I'm sorry.
Are you going to go for a beard as well? No, but you were saying we can be in our prime, and that we can just essentially like choose, how all of that goes.
Well, in that case, I'd like to be 6'3" and blonde for a change.
Why not? Yeah, I mean I guess that's kind of the hope of most people for the what comes next would be that there's lots of elements of choice. That's what I hope, is that lots of it is a choice. Like I don't. But would that be the case if it's that's another deep philosophical and speculative discussion, I guess, to get into. So we won't go into that now. But you don't want to speculate on whether you think, if survival is the case, about whether personality, identity, sense of self, these things continue. You're happy to kind of leave those for now.
Well, the evidence, such as it is, certainly doesn't indicate that everybody survives. It shows at best that some survive, and then only for a limited time. So I don't know how to make sense of that. I mean, does that mean we just survive in some sense with our psychological continuity intact, but our interest eventually just gets channeled elsewhere?
Yeah. Like, does it mean that while for a period of time we're still very engaged with this kind of physical world, and then eventually we, transition fully to be in this afterlife realm or whatever, one of a million other potential things happening?
Right.
Again, so much that could be at play. It's hard to nail it down, right? So again, if you have any words on this, great. If not, then no worries. It's kind of a big question, and like
I
But
can't
what do you
say
think
more
all
than
of this? No, on a new question. But I'm just giving you the preface of like no pressure, because it's kind of it would be a big question to answer, and all of that. And we've talked a lot already. So
now I'm scared.
but but no, I just wanted to get your thoughts on what all the phenomena we've discussed today and in our first interview, what all of that phenomena can tell us about the nature of reality, life, death, time, everything. Any insightful things you want to say?
I haven't got that worked out yet either. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise.
Yeah. You're not got the meaning of life either for me, I suppose.
No.
Maybe next time. No, that's fair enough.
One of my favorite comedians, Brother Theodore, once said, "Who knows what's behind the beyond? Most of us don't know what's beyond the behind."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, who knows? I like the end of Ralph Blumenthal's book. He's a reporter for the New York Times, and he wrote a biography about Dr. John Mack. He's written a bunch of other books as well. I think something. Am I going to remember the words, or am I going to choke now? Right at the end, as I'm about to quote it, something like, "No, I'm going to choke. That's what's going to happen." So, is there anything that we maybe haven't covered, or something related to all of this that you wanted to say, or any things you think we've missed before I ask you for kind of last words or anything like that? Is there anything, pertaining to the topics and phenomena that we've discussed? Maybe a medium that you wanted to mention, or a case that came into your mind? Anything at all?
Well, there are lots of cases we could have discussed, like the case of Patience Worth, but we can save that for another time. I think that's a really interesting case too.
Yeah. But as you said, I think we've given it a pretty good going over.
Yes, you've covered a lot of material.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you. I really appreciate it, Steve. I really appreciate, yet again, you've been really generous with your time. I really appreciate you sharing all of your experiences, your research, your knowledge, everything. This has been really enlightening, and I think people will enjoy it. I get quite a few comments about relating to like the super psi, and I know you hate that term, versus survival. And I think it is an interesting area, and the best we can do is kind of say that the evidence suggests one way. I certainly am in the camp that I think the evidence is suggestive of survival. I think it points towards survival, and I think there's such a big body of evidence and so many elements that even if you take out some of them, I think it's still kind of fairly strong and fairly suggestive, but I'm always use that word. I definitely don't think we're close to having kind of proof, as you say. But this has been a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate your point of view. Do you have any last words or a message or anything at all that you wanted to say to people that have watched and listened to this?
I'll just say that it would be nice if we had something close to the ideal cases that I described, because I think if the closer we get to that, the more arbitrary it becomes to deny that there's evidence for survival. At some point, if a case can be good enough, it's simply irrational not to accept the evidence for survival.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I guess just to tag onto that, the hope for that becomes ever more realistic, I think, as more people become interested in these phenomena, as it gets kind of gradually pushed into the light, into the mainstream, and becomes less of a taboo, and people realize like, oh, there is actually, at least evidence suggestive of, or at least interesting evidence to be looked at and discussed. More and more people are going to become interested, and hopefully more and more experiments are going to be done, and more data is going to be kept, and hopefully we're going to get there one day with that case, like you say, that just puts it all to bed.
I admire your youthful optimism.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you, and I look forward to hopefully doing this again at some point in the future.
Me too, thanks.
Thank you to Stephen Braude for talking with me. Thank you to our amazing patrons for helping us to keep the podcast alive. And thank you for listening. Please see the description for relevant links, including to Stephen's books and other interviews you might enjoy. Please subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us. And if you want to help us keep putting out content, please consider a monthly contribution via Patreon. That's the best way to help us. Thank you.